So this week in the Lords, I actually have only done 2 speeches, but it gives me an opportunity to explain my kind of behind the scenes, what the Lords is like moment. It was interesting because I gave a speech on the terrible story of the incestuous paedophile who changed gender in prison, left prison as a woman, and promptly called himself Claire Fox. So it was a story that I've told before, and I only really took up this issue because the paedophile's daughter, Carrie Lee Galvin, had herself broken her own anonymity. So you can see the speech below, but she knew it was too late for her, but she'd found a loophole in the law whereby if you change your gender in prison, then actually you can't be traced in terms of the sex offenders register, DBS checks and so on. So I did the story quite dramatic. There's a couple of things about it. First of all, Sarah Champion, who's a Labour MP in the place, as I say, in the Commons, had actually won an amendment with government backing so that you couldn't change your name by deed poll if you're a registered sex offender and out on licence from prison. You know, it had to be clear that you were the person who committed the crime, who just changed their name, disappear off the system, because that happens to hundreds and hundreds of people. And you don't want to be punitive, but it's just common sense. If you're going to have a sex offenders register, you need to know that the people on it are the people who have committed the sex crimes and that the information is reliable. That's the first thing. But the deed poll change actually didn't resolve this problem of a special legal protection of people who change their gender. So I was kind of on the back of the Labour Party's amendment, very complimentary about the Labour Party. The reason I'm saying that was because the Labour Party front bench absolutely was not having my amendment, and I really despise the fact that everybody who's spoken in the Victim and Crimes Bill has given victim stories all the time. That's what people do, particularly from the Lib Dem and Labour benches. And there's a danger of victim-centred justice. You know, I don't believe that we should believe all victims, but victims are often used as a kind of moral armoury in order to say we need to change the law because this victim said so. I was really nervous about the fact that poor old Carrie Lee Galvin, I won't say poor old, only in as much as I didn't want her case to be discredited by an association with me, who, let's be honest, the Labour Party and Lib Dem benches don't like as much as anything because of my gender critical views. So I went out of my way to try and avoid that by saying, no, this is about Carrie Lee, not about me. But they couldn't bring themselves to go along with it, and they effectively said that it was only a very few people it would affect, it was too complicated to do, and that was it. They would never let anyone else. It was sectarian in the extreme. They were both furious with me. And it was ironic because I was being so congratulatory of the Labour Party that the Labour Party front bench couldn't acknowledge that. The Lib Dem pro-victim advocate, no matter what the issue is, suddenly said that these particular victims didn't need any special legal changes. So that's interesting enough. But when you think about what's happened this week, I, last week in the same bill, had made a speech about the fact that the data that's being collected by criminal justice bodies is not accurate because they're not writing down consistently the sex that you have when you're registered at birth. Registered in as much as that's what you were born as. Not assigned at birth, which is the kind of trans activist term, but registered that's the legal document that says who you are. And it has to be at birth because you can now change your birth certificate. So in order to know the biological sex and for data to be consistently kept, and I explained all that in the speech last week, absolutely went down very badly, I'm afraid, by those feminists who say that we've got to have evidence-based policy on all criminal justice matters and that we've got to fight for women and girls fighting against violence, but not in this instance. They didn't want to know what biological sex the rapists or the sex abusers or the domestic violence perpetrators might be. So it's been interesting this week that we've had this terrible case of the man, Scarlett Blake, a trans woman, Scarlett Blake, but a biological male, who put the cat into a blender and live streamed it. And that's just the headline, because actually what he did was he murdered another man, and he's obviously a sadistic, violent criminal who's now been sent to prison. So far, no story to say, except it's been reported throughout the media, The Guardian and the BBC and Sky being most egregious, being reported as a woman who has committed this crime. So that, everybody said, oh, that's like what Baroness Fox was talking about last week, where you get this confusion about who's doing what crimes. But much worse than that, this week, the police have admitted that they retain the data and the statistics around crime in relation to this particular murderer, and have written down Scarlett Blake as a woman, even though they know Scarlett Blake isn't a woman, because guess what? Scarlett Blake's been sent to a men's prison, right? Then somebody else explained to me, well, I couldn't work out why a woman was being sent to a men's prison. I mean, it makes you think you're going mad. So the good thing about being in the Lords is you actually have a little bit more access to some important people, because the Police and Crime Commissioner of the Thames Valley had actually come out last week and said that Scarlett Blake should be acknowledged as a biological male, and the police should stop confusing things. The criminal justice should report accurately. I actually organised to have a cup of coffee with him, had a chat, and he's now put out a letter explaining why it's wrong that the police have done this, but why the rules need to change. And I suppose it's chipping away, but it's an indication of the fact that sometimes when you're giving these speeches in the Lords, there's hardly anyone there. It feels like, what am I doing this for? But that actually, in the issues that are being discussed in society, you can have more of a voice than you otherwise might have. The interesting thing about that row on the Kerry Lee Galvin, Claire Fox profile, who, by the way, his real name is Clyde Bundy, not Claire Fox, is that Baroness Brinton was the Lib Dem peer involved. And I've mentioned before that one of the things that can happen is that straight after we had that debate, we then went on to have a debate on physician associates and anaesthetist associates, I can't say it, so PAs and AAs, who are being used supposedly to help doctors in hospitals and GPs, but are, so the allegation goes, being used as cheap labour on a rota, and the public are being conned into thinking they're seeing the doctor when they're not. And also they're just people with degrees who have to just do a 2-year postgrad course, so they're obviously not qualified. But if you're a patient, you think you're seeing the doctor, you don't know that. And Baroness Brinton had put in a motion of regret about this and created a debate, as indeed did Baroness Bennett, Natalie Bennett from the Green Party, somebody who I think in the House of Lords I've never agreed with on anything at all, and we don't get on. And I found myself in a position where I was congratulating them genuinely for raising their motions around this issue, because they allowed a debate. Because what was happening was that the government had introduced the regulation of PAs and AAs by the General Medical Council, again even more implying that they were doctors, via secondary instrument. That would mean secondary instrument that there's no vote, hardly any discussion, you end up in a committee room, nobody really knows what the debate's on, and I thought I was going to be on my own with maybe one other person or something in there arguing against it. But actually, to their credit, these people who I don't normally get on with put in motions, and we actually had a really good debate. What was also interesting was that the Labour Party front bench, because they are obsessed with workforce reorganisation, had more or less accepted this status quo with the government, so they've kind of lined up to keep it from being debated properly. And although there wasn't a debate in the Lords, it was good that we were able to have a proper discussion. So I congratulate my opponents in other instances for raising something in a way that was made it democratic and public. I do want to just say on PAs and AAs, I'm not strict on this. The BMA, British Medical Association, have been completely partisan in as much as they've been protective of their members. And in order to be protective of their members, they've basically said that PAs and AAs are dangerous, shouldn't be seen by doctors. They've really kind of thrown them under the bus, but it's not their fault, is it, right? They're doing a good job. And I do agree with Labour on this, Wes Streeting in particular, that there does need to be new layers of medical healthcare. You know, you don't, it's fine. The doctor, the most qualified doctor, does not have to see you to do a blood test or do various things. There's lots of work that could be divided up. It's just that at the moment, the scope of the PAs and AAs is not clear. Anyway, won't bore you with that. You can see the speech below. The final thing that's obviously been going on in Parliament, the obsession of everyone, is the MP for Mansfield, Lee Anderson, who's been kicked out of the Tory party, lost the whip for his oafish, ill-thought-through explanation of why he was fed up with demonstrations of Islamists on the streets of London without anyone intervening, and managed to turn it into a conspiracy theory against Sadiq Khan, the mayor, implying he was kind of owned and bought by Islamists. Obviously ridiculous. I completely disagree with the expression of what he said, but I wanted to note one thing. Everyone I've spoken to said, but we all know what he meant. We're not stupid. We know what he meant, right? We now are in a situation whereby there is, in Parliament, it's gone from last week, a disgraceful example of elected parliamentarians saying that they were too scared of threatening behaviour by Islamists, not Muslims, Islamists, radicalised Muslims who actually are not interested in the faith but have got a political version of that. We know that is a real problem, and they have lots of support, sadly, amongst, you know, everything from student activists to the left to progressives and so on and so forth. There is a campaign of intimidation around Gaza, and we were talking about that as a society in a grown-up way, and we've avoided talking about Islamism ever since 7/7, 9/11, all the rest of it. We kind of don't want to talk about it, it's too difficult. The problem we now have is that because of Lee Anderson's unhelpful intervention, we now have to discuss Islamophobia, and you're not allowed to mention the fact that there's a kind of been a real rise in anti-Semitism, that a kind of Islamist atmosphere on some of the demonstrations has been really horrible if you're Jewish in London or in Manchester or anywhere else for that matter. And so we've got completely distracted by the wrong thing. And now, even if you use the word Islamism, you're accused of being Islamophobic, and the row is a definitional one around what Islamophobia is. It's a very unhelpful way of chilling the important debates that we need to have, and I will find any opportunity that I can to have this discussion. In the corridors of the Lords, everyone is whispering to each other, oh, this has just become a distraction. And by the way, Labour people have said this to me as much as anything else. It's a distraction from what we need to be talking about. But they won't say it out loud because they now are intimidated by the fact that they'll be accused of being Islamophobic. This is not helpful. Luckily, at the Academy of Ideas, our intention is to have these discussions in the open and get to the bottom of them. And yes, of course, look out for people who are prejudiced against anyone who's Muslim, and look out for people who are thinly veiled excuse for racism. Those people exist, of course they exist. Call that out. But don't call anyone who's worried about what's been happening in response to the pogrom on October the 7th and subsequent events, who's worried about Islamism, to try and shut down that debate is anti-democratic, anti-free speech, and doesn't help one Muslim, doesn't help one person in Gaza, and is actually very, very bad for democratic society.